Good morning and welcome to the 22nd meeting of the Rural Economy and Connectivity meeting. The meeting is going to be conducted in a hybrid format with two members of the committee, Richard Lyle and John Finney, and our witnesses participating remotely. Emma Harper, who is the member in charge of the Dogs Protection of Livestock Amendment Scotland Bill, cannot participate as a committee member during the scrutiny of her bill. However, Emma is joining us remotely today as the member in charge of the bill. Now, we are going to go straight on to agenda item 1, which is the Dogs Protection of Livestock Amendment Scotland Bill, and there will be two panels. We have a lot of questions to get through for these panels and quite considerable amount of witnesses, so I'd ask everyone if they could keep their questions and answers as short and focused as possible. Now, before we go any further, I would like to invite members of the committee to declare any interest they have, as this is the first evidence session of the bill. Peter.
Thank you, Convener. I would like to intimate that I am a member of a farming partnership in Aberdeenshire. Thank you.
Stuart.
I am the part owner of a registered agricultural holding on which sheep are regularly kept and therefore have an interest in this matter.
Thank you. Maureen, Deputy Convener.
Completely different. I'm an honorary associate member of the British Veterinary Association.
Thank you. And finally, I'd like to say I too am an honorary member of the British Veterinary Association. And I would also point out that I have an interest in an agricultural partnership in Speyside, and we have, for clarity, as partners in this farm, suffered from sheep worrying in the past. So I'd like to then move on and welcome the panel. I'd like to welcome these individuals from organisations involved in investigating and enforcing offences of livestock worrying. First of all, I'd like to welcome Fiona Lovett, the Director of Flock Health Limited, Inspector Alan Dron, the Chair of the Scottish Partnership Against Rural Crime and the National Rural Crime Coordinator from Police Scotland, and Kirstine Mackenzie, the Animal Welfare Officer from Perth and Kinross Council. Now, there was to be a fourth member of the panel who may be having problems with the technology to join. And as soon as he joins, I will let you know. But that will be Graham Hatton, if he manages to join us, who is the Assistant Team Leader of Operations Mid-Argyll, Kintyre and Isla Argyll and Bute Council. So, thank you, everyone. I would just say to the witnesses, if you could keep an eye on me when I call you in, and if I feel you're going off on a wee tangent, I might waggle my pen at you, and that means that I'm looking at you to stop on that particular track to allow another witness in. You're in the great position of I can't actually launch the pen at you because you're remotely, but you'll know when I get to that stage. So the first questions this morning are from John Finney. John, good morning.
Good morning, Convener, and just to advise you that both myself and Richard have highlighted to the staff that there's a slight issue with the sound in as much as it's very quiet. So hopefully I'm coming through okay to yourself. Thank you. Good morning, panel, and thanks very much indeed for your written evidence, which always helps the committee greatly. I wonder, can I ask each of you, in your professional experience, what your assessment of the scale and nature of the problem is, please?
Thank you. And firstly, we're going to go to Alan to answer that question. So, Alan, if you'd like to kick off on that, please.
Okay. Good morning, panel. Good morning, Chair. And thank you for the opportunity. In terms of, obviously, my current role and for Police Scotland, the Scottish Partnership Against Rural Crime with all our partners, we obviously see all aspects of the livestock, worrying. What we've tried to do is encourage and educate, which is obviously the key aspects first and foremost, but right throughout Scotland, in all parts of Scotland, including the Isles, there are instances every year of livestock worrying, whether it goes from a dog simply in a field or up to the very sort of far end where it's fatalities. If you wish, I can provide the figures that we have, which are obviously our facts, to go forward. I've got them broken down for you, both in terms of yearly figures and also what we do every year in terms of campaign figures, just to hope that gives a bit of clarity. For our yearly figures, 1st of April 2018 to 31st of March 2019, across Scotland there was 321 attacks of livestock reported to Police Scotland. Of these, 123 were investigated as crimes, which provides a crime to incident ratio of around about 1 to 3. And then at that time there was no records of the breed type or whether an owner was with a dog or whether it was by itself at the time of the incident. As time's gone on, we've tried to scrutinise this more closely. So for the year 1st of April 2019 to 1st of March 2020, our figures were 265 attacks on livestock reported to Police Scotland, and of these 118 were investigated as crimes. So slight improvement, gives a crime to incident ratio of about 1 to 2. Of that, it was recorded that 116 occurred when the owner, person in charge, was nearby or present. 115 of the attacks occurred when there was no person present. And there was a further 34 incidents being recorded as unknown, so it wasn't actually confirmed if there was someone in the vicinity or not. And so around about 50% of all incidents that we're finding during that year, an owner was present or the dog was just loose by itself. Also, the most prevalent breeds tend to be Huskies and Alsatians, German Shepherds. This year, 1st of April, and I've got the figures up to the 31st of August for you. So far, we're at 99 attacks on livestock reported to Police Scotland, of which 40 have been investigated as crimes. So again, an incident ratio of about 1 to 2. Of the 99 attacks that have been recorded, 56 occurred where an owner, person in charge, has been present. 31 of the attacks where there was no one present, and 12 where we are unsure whether someone was present or not. So I'm hoping that, particularly with the Spark partnership that went on last year, about Your Dog, Your Responsibility, which focused on particularly the dogs that were without owners and were just allowed to roam free. That has been a heartening increase in that, if you like, the number of attacks with a dog has been with someone present. So we're lowering the times that a dog is loose by itself. Again, for this year, it's Huskies and Alsatians that seem to be the most prevalent breeds. For the specific campaigns themselves,
Inspector, can I perhaps stop you there? There's a wide range of questions. You've given a very comprehensive answer there, and it was really just an initial scoping. I think within that there are several questions I could ask, but perhaps shouldn't at this stage. I wonder, could we hear from Ms. Lovett or Ms. Mackenzie, please?
Thank you. Fiona, why don't you start, and then we'll come to you, Kirstine. Fiona.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll carry on then. So I'm a sheep vet. I worked as a consultant last year with Ipsos Mori. So we undertook a survey commissioned by the British government. So we had 1,900 sheep farmers respond to that survey. It was done in a proper stratified manner. And basically over half those farmers, 51%, reported at any stage they had had a dog attack on their livestock. 14% of them reported a dog attack in the previous 12 months of the survey. So when those figures, I mean, there are large margins of error because, you know, it was a well statistically stratified survey, but you still have confidence levels. But as you multiply that up, it would be a total of 7,000 dog attacks a year in Scotland, with a confidence between about 4,000 and 10,000. So we know that only a third of farmers will report dog attacks to the police for whatever reason.
Perfect, thank you. And Kirstine, do you want to come in?
Yeah, we, the local authority, tend tend not to deal directly with the sheep worrying. It tends to be the police, but we have on occasions assisted the police. Sort of in the line of my job as an animal welfare officer, I do work with farmers, and I would agree with Fiona there that a lot of them do not report incidents of sheep worrying, particularly if there's not actually been a physical attack. And again, if there's no owner present or if the dog runs off, there's then no evidence. So, having just general conversations with farmers, I've had, sort of unofficial reports of sheep worrying that perhaps have happened months before and they haven't reported it. And again, working with dog owners, it's quite alarming how many of them are under the impression that their dog wouldn't do that, that their dog wouldn't chase sheep. And we try and educate dog owners, and it is quite alarming how many think that their dog would not chase a field of sheep. So, yeah, that's sort of my dealings.
John, before I come back to you, I'd quite like to bring in Stuart Stevenson and then come back to you, if I may, John, for another question. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. It's just a very short question to Inspector Drawn. Does he have information that tells us what proportion of the dog population the breeds Huskies and Alsatians represent? It may be the next panel can actually answer this rather than him. But I'm slightly surprised that Huskies, it's not a breed I see very often, although I have neighbours who have one. So I'm just interested to know.
Alan.
Very quick answer. We don't actually have the numbers. And what we have found is that Husky has become more popular, particularly amongst certain elements of society, as a status dog and is influenced bizarrely by the Game of Thrones.
Oh, okay. John Finney, back to you.
I feel I need to do a spirited defence of the German Shepherd dog, often known as the Alsatian. It's a very fine breed. Panel, much of the literature, indeed many of the responses, indeed we've sort of heard it a bit from yourself, there's a lack of evidence around this, perhaps the scale of the problem, and as Ms Mackenzie talked about, under-reporting, and in some instances a lack of data collection. I wonder, can I ask, do the panel believe that they've enough evidence to make an accurate assessment of how the problem should be addressed, including the need for new legislation, and if there are evidence gaps, what would help overcome these? And particularly, perhaps, Inspector Drawn, if you could comment on how we get the situation you've narrated, the number of attacks, and then what constitutes them being considered a crime. So I know that's a wide-ranging question, but we're trying to understand the evidence base that would support legislation, please.
Okay, so Alan, if you could answer that, and then we'll come to Fiona.
Okay, several points there. Obviously, in terms of do we have enough evidence, I would think absolutely. As Fiona obviously highlighted, and it's backed up by the majority of rural crime, approximately 1/3 is reported, 2/3 aren't. But with having so many contacts throughout Scotland and becoming more aware of the situation, it's a situation that will always exist. So we need to try and prevent it first and foremost. It does occur on the figures say, almost like on a daily basis across Scotland. So we have sufficient evidence. Over the last couple of years, there's been certainly more increased scrutiny, and we've actually made a point, and it is a priority of the Scottish Partnership Against Rural Crime, actually look at livestock attacks and worrying. In terms of the bill and the legislation going forward, we've tried and we will always continue to try education. As education at all levels is first and foremost. We have to try and prevent before anything actually happens. So that's the primary drive. In Scotland, obviously, there's changes to farming. So, for example, more camelids are now in Scotland. They deserve the same protection, which currently the 53 Act doesn't afford them. So that's a definite, very positive change. As is perception, having the word attack as part of this, I think, is key. Actually then drives home more of the gravity of the situation rather than just worrying. So I think there's better certainly communication, there's better involvement with partners, and I think everybody's over the point. Education is tremendous, it's the way forward, we can never do enough of it, but in the very small instances of real serious attacks and detriment to livestock and the landowners, there is no deterrent. And that is one of the things when we actually talk to folks whose dogs have maybe committed an incident, a lot of them know there is no deterrent, and it's that significant aspect that will reduce, hopefully, the more serious elements, and might, through perception, change how many dog owners view what their dog may or may not do.
Thank
I
you.
wonder, Inspector,
John.
Convener, could I clarify a point there? Yes, and it is if I noted you correctly, you quoted in successive years the number of attacks, and then you said there were crimes. What determines that an attack is not a crime, Inspector?
Yeah, in terms of, if first of all, somebody reports an incident to Police Scotland, as opposed to England and Wales, we record everything that is reported to us in terms of livestock worrying. So an incident is then recorded, police will then attend. As obviously Kirsten and Fiona have indicated, if the police arrive and there's maybe been a dog seen in a field and there is not maybe sufficient evidence to support that an actual offence under legislation has occurred, then that is where obviously some are reported and recorded as an incident. But then if there's sufficient evidence, then that is where obviously a crime and a crime report is recorded, where police are obviously then taking as much evidence, looking to obviously charge someone. Can we get a dog control notice, and can we ultimately get a case away to the fiscal?
Thank you. John, sorry, just before we go any further, I think I'm going to bring Fiona in. Fiona, you wanted to come in.
Thank you. Yes, just asking for evidence is really pertinent, and I was a bit alarmed in some of the responses to your consultation. A number of people quoted the background for the huge study that we undertook last year for the Scottish Government, where in the background we stated that the existing evidence didn't provide adequate basis for assessing the true scale, and that was the whole reason that the survey was undertaken. So this contacted over 9,000 sheep farmers. It was truly done because we didn't have evidence previously other than the perception that there's an increase in the amount of attacks. But that could be a social media thing. It could be sort of farmers upping making it sound worse. So this whole study was done and by an independent body and done with a whole purpose of actually collating evidence. So statistically, it was extremely robust. And to avoid the potential for what we call recall bias, where people either remember the most dramatic incident or the most rather than the most recent, the interviewers and the survey was very careful to pin down people and only ask them about the most recent incident in detail. We gave them the opportunity to give more information, but for the stats put into the study, it was the most recent incident. So we can be fairly sure that we have got robust evidence that this is a problem that 14% of farmers have experienced in the last year, and 50% ever. So I do think we do have evidence. That's different as to what the penalty should be, and that's not my area of expertise, but we do have evidence that's an issue.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. And I'm afraid, John, we are going to have to move on to the next question.
Well, thank you very much.
And if I could just remind witnesses, those are the first couple of questions from one panel member. There's 11 panel members, and we'll all be wanting to ask lots of questions. But if they all take 20 minutes, we may be here till Christmas. So the next question is from Richard Lyle. Richard, good morning.
Thank you, Convener. I'll try not to take 20 minutes. Morning, panel. In your opinion, why are the powers under the existing dog control legislation sufficient? And if not, why not?
Alan, let's start off with you on that, if we may. Alan.
Okay, just again very quickly and to the point. In terms of a 1953 Act that is many years old, and we're now in the 20th century, 2020, a bit behind the times. Farming has changed. Obviously, the introduction of extending the definition of livestock, absolutely, to include various things such as camels, ostrich, etc. having the word attacks, very much so, because again, that increases the severity and the perception of what this is trying to achieve. And again, as has already been highlighted, in terms of a deterrent, currently there is not a sufficient deterrent, whether that be in terms of a fine or seizure of the dog, to then obviously different measures. And that's why I think this bill introducing something that's a bit more sufficient to cover a small gap.
Okay, Richard, do you want to go with your
same question to Kirsten?
Richard, with
I think the same question.
Yeah, I'm feared of asking the same question to everyone, just because of the ability to call more.
I'd like to get, with the greatest respect, I know you're on a time frame, but I'd like the opinion of Kirsten McKenzie.
Kirsten, and sorry, just before you answer that, Kirsten,
Yeah,
it's
I
very,
would agree.
sorry, Kirsten, sorry, just before you answer that, my difficulty is, Richard, is I can't see which witnesses want to come in. It's not like being on a committee meeting where I can see the witnesses, but delighted to bring everyone in where I can. Kirsten, if you'd like to come in.
Yeah, I would agree with Alan. There's not a severe enough penalty at the moment, and yeah, I agree exactly with what Alan has just said.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Do you think that the new bill as drafted will help to reduce the instances of livestock worrying? Could it be improved to make it more effective? To any member of the panel.
Who'd like to head off on that? What about you, Fiona? You didn't get a chance at the last one, Fiona.
As a sheep veterinary surgeon, to be honest, my expertise is not on penalties, as it were. So I could tell you what the farmers thought. The top thing they wanted was a better public awareness and campaigns. Second was greater penalties, and third was a requirement to have dogs on leads on agricultural land. Those were by far the most popular requests from the farmers interviewed.
Alan?
Okay, sorry, Alan.
Again, just very quickly, backing up what Fiona has said, I think this is one new aspect which will hopefully reduce, and it will go hand in hand with prevention, which will always continue, better education, but the introduction of better penalties as a good deterrent in itself.
Okay.
Alan, you said, and quickly convener, Alan, you said the last time the law was changed was 1953. That was in the 20th century. This is now the 21st century. So, nearly 70 odd years since that law was changed, yes?
Yeah, absolutely. And then obviously there's been additions such as control of dogs in 2010, but obviously primarily the 53 Act being the main one for livestock worrying.
That's fine. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Richard. The next question is from Colin Smith. Colin, and I'm probably going to come to Kirsten to start with. Colin.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm sure Richard Lyle remembers that legislation well. In the interest of time, I'll try and combine maybe both my questions. And there are three parts to that. A number of the evidence that we've received has highlighted the need for a better use of existing powers that we have. So can I ask the panel, do the order-making powers in the bill complement or overlap with the ability to use dog control notices, and would the increased use of dog control notices in cases of livestock worrying be beneficial? And I suppose my final point is there any other non-legislative methods that would could be deployed in order to tackle the problem?
Kirsten.
Yeah, we can, and I have actually issued a couple of dog control notices on dog owners that have been involved with the sheep worrying. And the problem with the dog control notices, especially in very rural areas, it's very difficult to monitor the compliance of them. As I say, we can put on the dog control notice that a dog must be kept on a lead, even in specific areas, but they're very difficult to monitor the compliance. But they can be used, and they have been used with the sheep worrying incidents.
Alan, do you want to
But
come?
I think
Sorry, Kirsty, I cut you off. I thought you'd finished. Sorry.
no, that's fine. That's okay.
Okay. Alan, do you want to come in on that?
Just very quickly, I would support what Kirsten is saying. I think for me, in more instances, particularly where an incident is reported to the police, the dog control notices or with the local authority officers should be working more hand in hand. And it's yet another stage where things could be joined up. I think overall what is being proposed is adding another layer, and it's certainly something that is to the benefit rather than more bureaucratic or would cause any other issue.
Colin, do you want to?
Just very briefly, I mean, are there any other non-legislative methods that we should be deploying alongside the legislation to help tackle the problem?
Alan, do you want to come in on that?
I think for us, every year through the Scottish Partnership Against Rural Crime, we run livestock campaigns. What we did last year was have one large launch, and then we took it all around Scotland. So there was numerous local launches, try and make it more personal. And the more personal we can try and make it to every part of Scotland and raise awareness is vital. And that is something that should never stop. And I think through prevention and education first and foremost, hopefully that will then start in time to reduce instances and also educate maybe through vets, the practices themselves, every stage of somebody in society owning a dog, right up to from puppy to obviously end of life.
And Fiona, do you want to come in on that? Just was there anything that farmers brought up in relation to non-legislative actions that could be taken to prevent this?
No, only the most popular, 93% of them wanted increase in public awareness, and I think partly because often it's a dog the owner's unaware, or it's a one-off incident. Those cases, I think public awareness is that any dog could be an issue. Education again.
Okay, Colin, okay, fine, thank you. I think the next questions are going to come from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Yes, thanks, Convener. I would like to look into the proposed penalties. And in the most serious cases, the bill proposes that the courts are able to impose a custodial sentence. But I wonder if instead of a custodial sentence, they can choose to impose a community payback order, for example, ordering the offender to pay compensation, attend a course or carry out unpaid work. Do you think that the use of community payback orders along these lines in this type of crime would be appropriate?
I think that probably is Alan to start that off, and then I maybe come on to Kirstine on that afterwards. Alan, do you want to start with that?
I think every option would be an excellent step forward. I think what has to be borne in mind in a couple of the most serious incidents throughout Scotland, unfortunately, the person who was convicted was neither able to pay compensation and also was unable to do community payback just through circumstances. But I think that element of this bill would only affect a very small minority of cases. And I think that's where the deterrent element, apart from anything else, is actually possibly more significant. It's certainly whether it's a community payback, whether it's anything, it's also got to be another positive step to trying to reduce this incident.
Can I just come in there, just as a follow-up to that? I mean, I'm sure many farmers would like to see compensation in severe cases. It can cost many thousands of pounds. And I think the feeling is that the compensation element is lacking in this proposed bill. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that. You have already said that in some cases folk can't pay, but there are many cases when I'm sure people could pay.
Absolutely. And there's one recent case that went to the courts. Person was convicted and the sheriff put in a compensation order, and the farmer who was at loss has received full compensation, which was excellent. The system does work. And again, the thing to remember is current legislation, if it's all applied, absolutely no problem at all. This is adding a weight and strength to these, more so as a deterrent element, and also hopefully in the more serious incidents. It's not carte blanche. This is definitely going to add weight to the more serious, which hopefully will continue to be the fewest incidents that we come across.
Okay, Fiona, do you want to come in on that?
Only to say the average cost of the incidents to the farmer was £700 per dog attack, and only 9% of them had received any financial either insure. Most of them don't consider they can insure because they're worried about their premiums going up. So most farmers are not currently compensated for the loss.
Okay, and Kirsty, just before we do, can I just ask, do you think people realise the value of some of these sheep that are injured? I mean, tups could be worth tens of thousands of pounds, £20,000. In fact, £200,000 and plus. We've got a bid at the back. I've just sold my tup to Stuart Stevenson for £300,000. But there's the value of the livestock is incredible. Kirsty, do you want to pass comment on that?
Yeah, I don't think general public are aware of the financial, implications that the farmers have if there is a sheep attack or even a sheep worrying incident. So I think really education and awareness is very important to help reduce the number of incidents. And again, I've already highlighted to make people aware that any dog has the ability to cause a problem. I know that the larger breeds are perhaps more likely to actually cause physical damage or injury, but any dog can be responsible for causing an incident.
Yeah. I think that there's a general agreement for most commentators that the current penalties are too low, and some folks cite higher penalties for other animal welfare offences, and they cite the Animal and Wildlife Act 2020, in which they introduced the power to impose an unlimited fine and up to 5 years in prisons. And I just wonder if something along that lines would be suitable for in the very most severe cases of attack.
Kirsty, as you're on the screen, you could stay on the screen and answer that, and then I'll go to Alan. You can duck it if you want to.
Yeah, no, I think a severe is a severe penalty for the worst cases would be very welcome. I think even going as far as a ban on keeping dogs in the worst case scenario. I think there has to be, a severe penalty for the worst cases.
Alan, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I would just echo what Kirsten said. I think in these circumstances, it's likely to be very small, and each case would be taken on, obviously, its own merits. Also would depend proportionality. If it is, as you say, a tup, and the tup's going for something, £250,000 as opposed to a blackface yow at maybe £70, then obviously proportionality comes into it. But ultimately, anything that assists and is there as a deterrent cannot be a bad thing.
Okay. Yows must be cheap where you are. Peter, you want to come in on that?
Well, I'll move on to the last question. As in the 2020 Act, there's a ability for the use of fixed penalty notices for less serious worrying offences. I wonder if that's something that we should be thinking about within this bill as well.
Alan, and then I'll come to Kirsty.
It's another option. Obviously, police officers already have the option to give out fixed penalty notices for a variety of offences. Again, it would maybe just depend on scale and proportionality.
Kirsty, fixed penalty notices.
Yeah, I agree with Alan. We already, have fixed penalty notices. So, yeah, I mean, that would be, a deterrent for smaller, offences.
Okay, thank you. Stuart Stevenson, I think you've got the next questions. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. I'm going to ask the second of the questions first, if I may. I just want to explore and probably in the light of previous responses, first with Kirsten, whether powers to exclude offending owners from walking their dogs on agricultural land is going to work. And I ask that because of the previous comments about difficulties of enforcement in rural areas, which I think I clearly understand. And it would be perhaps useful to the committee to just talk through the practicalities of such an approach and whether it would add anything to what else is there. Perhaps, as I say, starting with Kirsten, and then I suspect Inspector Drawn too.
Kirsten.
Yeah, I think the difficulty of banning someone from walking in a particular area. I get already said the remote areas. It's very difficult to police that or to monitor that, and then also sort of corroborating evidence that that person has been walking in that area. It can be very difficult to sort of prove that that person has been there doing what they shouldn't be doing. So I think that it's quite difficult just with the type of areas that we're dealing with.
But before I move on, perhaps I can just take it a tiny step forward. The corroboration, of course, is if it's a criminal offence, but the alternative could be to provide a civil prohibition, which of course would not require corroboration. Is that something that's been discussed as an alternative approach?
I'm not sure about that one. I'm not sure. Just know any sort of non-compliances, offences. You tend to need corroboration. So I'm not sure.
That's fine. Thank you.
Kirsten, just before you go, could you just clarify for me, how many animal welfare officers are there in Perth and Kinross Council?
There's 2 animal welfare officers and there's 1 dog control officer who deals primarily just with the dog-related incidents. I do dog control when the dog control officer's off. So there's 2 full-time animal welfare, 1 dog control officer to cover the whole of Perth and Kinross Council area.
So 3 people spread fairly thin to try and make sure that these notices would come. Alan, I think Stuart wanted to hear from you. Alan.
Yeah, I would totally again support what Kirsten said. I think the practicalities of that element would be very difficult to enforce. Certainly, it's easier to prove if somebody was disqualified from owning or keeping a dog, i.e. if you went to their home and there was a dog there, it's easier then to also prove one way or another. But if they're out in the public and walking, how do you actually catch them at that point? How do you follow them? How would you actually know? I think the practicalities would prove very difficult, particularly as Scotland, as you know, is a rural country.
Stuart, do you want to come?
Right, I'll move on to my other question, which is essentially a technical and legal drafting question, which it may well be the panel doesn't particularly want to comment, but just are the powers within the bill was drafted that allow order-making powers, are they appropriate and proportionate? I suspect it may be that no one wishes to make any comment, but this is the opportunity to do so if you wish.
Unfortunately, if you were all present, you could all look away at the same time, so you could all. I knew that none of you wanted to answer, but Alan, you're on the screen. Do you want to answer?
I would just say, obviously, not really for me to comment.
Okay. I'm trying to see if any of the other witnesses want to say anything. No one's indicating. So, Stuart, is that you sufficient? And then we'll move on to the next questions, if we may, from Angus. Angus.
Thank you, Convener. With regard to enforcement and investigation, we know that there are issues with enforcement of current livestock worrying legislation, and clearly the bill aims to tackle some of these issues by introducing increased powers for investigation. So would you say, or what would you say are the biggest challenges you currently face in enforcing the existing legislation on livestock worrying, and do you think that the new bill will help to address these challenges?
Probably Kirsty, followed by Angus, just to make it slightly different order. Kirsty, do you want to head off on that?
I think it. Yeah, I think it probably be better Alan answering this question.
Sorry, Alan.
Is the
yeah.
Currently are the enforcement body. Sorry, yeah.
Alan, sorry, I just called you Angus. I'm getting myself confused already, and it's only 20 to 10. So please head off.
I think in terms of how we enforce, this will certainly help. I think it might instill a bit more seriousness about the actual incidents through perception. It's something that certainly we can use some of the terminology in better campaigning, more targeted campaigning, because we have that to highlight. I think it's everything in its part. We've got to educate from schools upwards, at the vets, go around Scotland, try and do as much as we can to raise awareness, but then having this at the back of us so that if all that has failed, at least there is something that's actually got weight, something that people then take notice of and sit up and take notice rather than just a smaller fine or they think, they'll get away with it. Also internally within our police officers, we are constantly trying to educate, raise awareness, increase better education on this particular offence, which slowly but surely is starting to work, which hopefully is why the ratio of what is quite small for when an incident is reported to police actually going out, investigating, and then hopefully taking a crime report for.
Angus, do you want to?
No, that's fine, thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. At this stage, I'd just like to welcome Christine Graham, who's attending the committee as Emma Hopper's substitute. Oliver, I think...
I apologise for my lateness. It was put in my diary for 10 o'clock, not for 9 o'clock.
Well,
so I apologise.
Apology very much accepted, and you've missed some interesting evidence, but I'm sure you shall catch up. Oliver, the next questions are for you. Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. And in the kind of interest of time, the 3 questions I'm hoping to ask would be directed to Fiona Lovett as they relate to veterinary matters. And I was just going to ask kind of all 3 of them together, if that was okay. It was to ask what additional resources vets would require in order to play a statutory role, for example, in relation to training and remuneration, whether there are any legal or whether there's any legal or operational clarity that needs to be provided to support vets in playing such a role, and if she was able to briefly describe what procedures would be involved to collect evidence from the dog, and whether she could foresee any circumstances in which those procedures would jeopardise the health or welfare of the dog.
A lot of questions there, Fiona. Head off, as it were.
Okay, so one of the key things is if a dog is presented to a vet, then they need to have permission from the owner generally. So we sometimes have issues where the police have called us to a road traffic accident, for example. We then have to have permission from that police officer to put an animal to sleep, for example. We need permission from somebody, otherwise we're acting, and so I could foresee a similar sort of issue if a dog is brought into a practice by anyone other than the owner of the dog. That puts a vet in a particularly awkward position, and they actually are unable to make a decision, if you know what I mean, for fear of being in trouble themselves, as it were. So that's one answer, I think, and I think it would have to be the police that were able to give that permission. In terms of evidence, forensic evidence, that's not actually my area of expertise. So I'm a sheep specialist, not a dog specialist, but there would need to be a need for training. It wouldn't necessarily be something that would be appropriate for every small rural practitioner who's actually dealing with a mixed bag of issues, and this could be quite a small sporadic thing. Whether the rural colleges, SAC, the labs, those vets potentially would be more appropriate. So often as a veterinary surgeon, we would send animals for a post-mortem, and actually there could be a specialist within that regional laboratory who would be able to advise and take some of that responsibility. I think that covers most of the questions.
Oliver.
That's helpful. I just wondered, you said that you felt it would have to be the police, and I know other members are kind of coming on to questions in that area, but obviously this bill, as it's currently drafted, gives powers for agents to be appointed to sort of exercise certain provisions. Do you think that that would present a problem for vets if someone else was bringing a dog in other than the police?
So the vet would always get permission. That I could just foresee an issue if someone other than the police. I mean, at a road traffic accident, the vet really wants the policeman to sign to say either they give permission and that someone will pay for it. So vet's a private enterprise. So they're kind of watching their own back, but they're also watching their own pocket. You know, they're provided they need somebody to both give permission legally, but also to stand whatever that cost is. So in that sense, somebody in the SRUC rural colleges, the laboratories already has some sort of government permission, I suppose.
Okay, sorry, can I just take that to Alan on a question that if a dog is seized and is taken to a vet for examination to identify whether an offence has happened and some evidence is collected, needs to be collected, I don't know, I'm trying to think wool between the teeth or something that, will the police officer then be in a position under this legislation to sign for a vet to do that? And will they be taking responsibility, or is that something that we need to clarify within the bill?
Again, it might come down to circumstances and extent of injury and case. Just now, just to go back to Fiona's point, the SRUC currently for wildlife crime will conduct a lot of inquiries at the request of the police, and from the funding aspect, that's all covered by the Scottish Government. So there is already a precedent set there about for wildlife crime, and whether that could then be extended for livestock incidents. In terms of police taking, obviously, dogs to the vet, it actually happens on very, very few incidents, and normally the only ones that I'm aware of is where, under legitimate reasons, the farmer or landowner may have shot the dog, and the police will take the dog, possession of that, will take it to a vet to ensure that the dog, if it's still alive, is not suffering, and also to treat it, or if it has died, then to make sure it was shot properly, if you like, so there's no undue suffering. And certainly that is the only circumstances that I'm aware of where police will actually seize the dog and take it to a vet.
Okay, sorry, just to follow that up with that, in instances of wildlife crime, I would suspect that most of the instances of wildlife crime are actually dealing with evidence, i.e. it's things that have happened. It may be a poisoning incident or a shooting incident where the actual animal or the bird is dead. But this may be an instance where a dog has been caught, there is no owner present, and the police want to take it to the vet to gather evidence of sheep attacks, which, as I think has been discussed, is collection of forensic evidence. I mean, what I would like to know is, do you feel comfortable the police have the ability to take that to a vet, sign for that work to be carried out, taking responsibility not only for that decision, but also the cost? Because otherwise, wool between the teeth of a sheep will disappear fairly quickly. And I'd like to know that that's the sufficient coverage in the bill for that.
Anytime I think that would happen, in very few instances, that the police would contact the relative fiscal to ensure, because a lot of it will come down to cost and actual seizure and then homing, because it might be that we need to keep the dog for, say, 24 hours to allow for diesel, for obviously taking the actual sampling, and then to actually contact a vet to actually come out. So in terms of homing, and then we also would then have a duty of care for that dog, in terms of like feeding and watering, etc. as well. Certainly something that would need clarity And I think it was something that we highlighted in our submission, that particularly when it comes to any financial implications, both for policing, homing, and for, as Fiona's highlighted, veterinary aspects as well.
Thank you. I think the next questions... Oliver, sorry, are you happy?
Convener, I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the next questions are from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Thank you, Convener. Excuse me. Good morning, panel. I'm concerned about Section 4 of the bill, and that is headed powers to authorise entry, search and seizure. Now, to me, this does give authority in law for a police officer, or indeed an appointed inspector, to enter premises without a search warrant. So isn't this a major and rather disproportionate move away from Scots law, where a police officer needs just cause to show just cause to a sheriff or a justice of the peace for a warrant to search premises? Can I just say, I'm not talking about the power a police constable has to enter premises if he believes a crime is underway or about to take place. This is about searching for evidence. So isn't this a departure, a major departure from Scots law?
Thank you, Mike. And I guess, Alan, you're in the spotlight again.
Yeah, for this one, and also we would liaise very closely with the fiscal regarding that element, because you're absolutely right, it's an unusual step, particularly for the circumstances, because obviously we need to make sure there's reasonable grounds for suspecting the evidence connected to the alleged commission of offence of livestock worrying was to be found in specified premises, and there was no other means of obtaining that evidence. And currently, obviously, policing, we will try every opportunity before moving to that stage to try and gain as much evidence. So again, that I think might end up being, if it was passed, as very much a case-by-case basis, and it would be very much in conjunction with contacting the local fiscal for the area, but only after, I would suggest, as much normal common sense policing and investigation has been carried out that would lead us to that point where in other circumstances to get that bit of evidence we would need to apply for a warrant ultimately.
Yes, but that's the law as it stands. You would need to apply for a warrant, and I absolutely understand everything you've said. But this bill would give the police, and indeed inspectors appointed by organisations, the legal authority not to apply for a warrant if they didn't need to. And it says here, I'm just very surprised that this has appeared here in relation to this crime, awful as it is. But it does really mark a major departure from what everybody's accepted in Scots law is one of the safeguards to prevent undue searches of people. Do you agree that this changes that position?
Alan.
I think it would be an interesting step, because I could foresee the police go to a house, having tried to gain as much evidence as possible, and then if we were refused at that point of entry by the householder after explaining why we were there, we'd also need to ensure that we give due regard to any potential suspect their right not to self-incriminate, and to caution any suspect prior to any questioning. But I think it would be very, very unusual if we actually got to that stage. I think it would need a lot of clarification. I also think I could see it being contested in court if the police obviously went, gained access without the need for a warrant, unless, of course, we were welcomed in by the house owner and you had actually said, look, it was my dog, I was actually going to come and contact you, whatever the circumstances. And I could see it being very much on a case-by-case basis.
Yes, I understand that the police would operate this sensibly, but there will be cases, because this will change the law. It actually says in subsection 4.2, this subsection is complied with, that's the need for a warrant, in relation to premises if either admission to the premises had been refused or such a refusal may be reasonably expected. So actually, even if you expect a refusal, according to the law change here, you could enter any premises to search for evidence. That's what this bill says, does it not?
It would appear so.
Yeah.
But then I could see again in practicalities, when we got into that premises, we would need to tread as police officers very carefully, because obviously you may be there for one reason but observe something else, at which point you need to stop and then obviously you need to go and maybe get a warrant.
Yeah,
So-
I'll just finally say that I understand what you're saying, and it sounds very reasonable, but our job as MSPs is to look at the law that's presented to us. And certainly it seems to me, and I'd appreciate as we go on further down looking at this process, this law does, and it's interesting, like you said, that you agreed with that it does, my interpretation that it does, and it seems quite clear, it changes the law, and it gives the police, if they were so inclined, the power to enter premises to search without a warrant. Okay, thank you.
So, sorry, I know Stuart wants to come in. A quick question, if I may, before Stuart comes in. Do you feel you need that bit in the legislation to make this bill worthwhile, or do you think there's enough in the bill to make it worthwhile without that?
From personal point of view, 28 years policing, I would suggest from policing perspective that might not be required for a variety of reasons. It might overcomplicate things. We might end up having to go for a warrant anyway. I think we'd be always on stronger grounds if we had a warrant. And I also think it would actually be on very, very few instances and cases where the police would be acting towards that situation anyway.
Thank you, Alan. Stuart wants to ask you a question on that.
I think it is directed at Inspector Drawn. Is he familiar with the 1951 Salmon and Freshwater Fisheries Protection Scotland Act, which at paragraph 11.4 grants powers of search to water bailiffs appointed by Salmon Fisheries Board without the necessity of a warrant. Lest you wonder why, having been a water bailiff in 1968, I was aware that that was a power that I had when, even as a summer student, I was fulfilling that role. And I just wondered if we were familiar with that. It may not be quite as novel as as my colleague is suggesting.
So, Alan, do you want to answer that? I'm sure you didn't exercise that in 1951, Stuart, but Alan. Oh, well, there you go. That ages you. Alan.
Certainly, it will be my colleague, who is the Wildlife Crime Coordinator, will be very familiar with that aspect. As to how often that would be used or not, and in the circumstances, I, again, would not know and couldn't comment on it.
Okay. And
correct, not 1951 when I exercised.
Oh, sorry. And just for the avoidance of doubt, in the past I've declared an interest in the wild salmon fisheries, so as I made a comment, I ought to make that clear, not that it's really that relevant. The Deputy Convener's got some questions. Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. I think this question is probably to Inspector Drone. You will be aware that the bill suggests that there should be additional capacity from an inspecting body, whatever that might be. Do you think you would find that beneficial?
I think anything that can help policing, police resourcing, and also education certainly can't be detrimental. I think going forward and trying to think of practical examples, there would need to be clear clarity round about who would have primacy. And currently, obviously, it's only police that can actually investigate. But in lots of rural locations, whether it is someone from the local authority, whether it is the dog warden, whoever can assist corroboration for a police officer will attend. If you look at current similar circumstances, particularly in relation to fly tipping, is it SEPA? Is it local authorities? Is it policing who has primacy regarding fly tipping? And sometimes it can blur the lines for particularly those who are either the victims or phoning in to know who to contact and then who to actually expect will do something in relation to the incident or offence.
So I'm sort of picking up from what we've already discussed today, that, and also what the SPCA, Scottish SPCA have said in their evidence, that they wouldn't want to be the body. I'm picking up that you would rather it be some sort of statutory body like the local authority or something like that.
I think it would need to be clarity, and as Kirsten's already highlighted, in practical terms, if you look at Perth Ross, and it's a very rural local authority area covering a large geographical area, there is technically only 3 of them that cover that area. So potentially to ensure a better quality of service and, as and when required, certainly policing being 24/7. I think if there was to be any additional bodies, it would need to be quite clear who they could be, what they could offer, and when they would actually go out, make sure that everybody who they were attending knew who had primacy and who to contact in the first instance.
And in terms of any prosecutions being taken forward, it would have to be you, so you would have to be involved. Police Scotland would have to be involved.
Yeah, by and large, for currently cases that are getting submitted to the fiscal, that's obviously through policing. Obviously, as Kirsten's highlighted earlier, local authority dog wardens can also issue dog control notices, and there are other obviously means that could be done in terms of educating or other avenues of how we could resolve something, an incident.
While I have got the floor, can I just ask as well, how often is video footage of a dog worrying or a dog attack on animals used as evidence?
I think this is something that's increasing because policing now has sort of individual PDA systems which officers are now getting rolled out with, so they can capture obviously normal static photographs. There is obviously incidents where maybe a farmer, a landowner, or somebody out walking has captured an actual incident, and anything that can get put forward as best evidence in a case to the fiscal would obviously be submitted.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Kirstin, I wondered if you wanted to come in on that particular point about additional powers, which may involve you.
Yeah.
You're on.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously have the powers to already. Obviously already have the powers to issue control notices, which we do. And I think we welcome Police Scotland to still be the sort of primary agency for this, and we quite happily, work jointly with them, and observe, have a sort of protocol with them. But yeah, we're always happy to be an assisting agency and work together with Police Scotland.
Thank you. Fiona, I know you're still there and you're going to be probably the one to answer the first question, or to answer the questions that Christina is about to place. So, Christine, I think you've got some questions.
I didn't actually think so. I could be wrong. I thought my question is about money and about the financial, human and technical resources required to accompany legislation. Nearly every piece of legislation comes with a bill attached to it. And of course, this is to some extent predicated. I'm so sorry, phone is going off now. What a morning. To some extent, it's predicated on who or what is the inspecting body, because that'll come with a bill as well. So I'm just going to ask, actually, the panel, what money would they require, funding, in order to make sure that this legislation actually works?
Okay, so let's go to Alan to start with, and not Fiona, but I'll give you all a chance to answer that question. Alan, if you'd like to head off on that.
To be honest, I have absolutely no idea. And again, a lot of it would be done and consumed under normal policing, as it is just now. Any financial implications normally will come about if a dog is actually seized, and then it goes back to the point we were making earlier, contacting a fiscal. Is it proportionate? Who would actually pay the bill for homing, welfare, and then onward keeping of that animal?
Okay. Do you want to come in on that, Kirstin?
Yeah, again, local authority are stretched financially at the moment. At any time, we have very limited resources. We deal with, lots of other things, and I think there would be perhaps more finances, especially if we were going to be involved in a large education programme, we don't have the resources at the moment, I would imagine, as a council to provide out budgets already.
And Fiona.
The ongoing costs, I'm not sure. Currently, out of the survey that we undertook, the current cost of dog attacks to sheep farmers in Scotland is £5.5 million a year. And so currently farmers are standing those costs because, as I said, 9% are currently receiving money for those attacks.
Okay.
So that's their current cost.
Christine, do you have any further?
I mean, it's extremely difficult. I think, if you can correct me, but I think the SSPC now can charge for keeping an animal pending a trial about to the owner about the dog being out of control or savaging sheep and so on, or other beasts. Am I correct? And that they can actually, they don't have to keep it now, because we used to have huge bills. I know Mike Flynn's coming on later, but perhaps the police could remind me of who pays for that.
Who pays, Alan?
I think in the new, for the SSPC, I think that is what they now currently do. The difficulty also comes if a dog that has been worrying livestock is taken, but there's no owner found, who then actually pays for that dog. And a lot of that would need to be clarified from the outset. And also then in some circumstances, an owner would just sign their dog over. So does that then mean the SSPC need to also find a rehome? I know the Dogs Trust are going to be giving evidence later on as well, so they might be able to take that on further as well.
That's fine, thank you.
Okay. And finally, I think Emma Harper, whose bill it is, would like to ask some questions. So, Emma, I'll give you a few questions if you'd like to start off on your first one. Emma, good morning.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning. It's been really interesting hearing everybody's contributions this morning, and I want to thank the witnesses and the members for their diligence in their questioning and the answers. I'm interested. There's a couple of questions. Is there one particular part of the country where there are more incidents than another, like Highlands versus south of Scotland? Are we able to take apart the data to look at where more incidents occur?
Alan.
Fortunately, one of our colleagues goes on a daily basis and trawls by policing divisions. So at 13 policing divisions, we know exactly where there are instances of livestock attacks and worrying. Unfortunately, it's actually throughout Scotland. We've recorded instances in Shetland, Orkney, the Western Isles. Some of the worst ones this year were actually in Oban. One of the worst incidents that we're aware of obviously happened at Inverary. And a lot of the more numbers are quite near Central Belt, as you could imagine, just through volume, but also areas where there are, for example, core paths, such as the West Highland Way, Conic Hill, being a particular incident for Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park. It's where you would expect people would be out walking dogs, but it is actually quite widespread throughout the country. There are no specific one areas where it is higher than others.
Emma.
Has coronavirus affected the ability to monitor or capture or look at the data? Have you seen a reduction when people were in lockdown, or then did you see an increase when folks started escaping from their homes and going out with their dogs for their daily exercise?
So Alan, followed by Fiona. Alan.
Okay, thank you. This was something that we were very aware of, and we're starting to gather stats on. What we did was we tried to compare from the 1st of January to the 31st of May, which was going to be a campaign for this year. And currently, what we found is a significant decrease in the number of incidents. Currently, from the 1st of January to 31st of May, which was going to be the comparative period to last year, there was 120 incidents of livestock attacks reported. 52 of them were recorded as crimes. We found 68 dogs were accompanied, 46 weren't. And the numbers are significantly lower as the COVID restrictions went on. Through speaking to a lot of landowners, walkers, etc., I think these figures would educate and sort of also complement what we'd thought. During lockdown, more folks were at home. They were obviously, if they were going out walking their dog, with their dog, which is why there was a bit more of a spike in terms of 6 to 8 of the offences where somebody, an owner or person responsible for that dog, were present, as opposed to only 46 this time where they weren't. And by and large, as obviously lockdown restrictions have eased, then particularly around the central belt areas, folks have tried to get back out and about, and obviously for good reasons. We've seen a slight increase, but not a dramatic increase, which is encouraging.
Fiona.
I don't have any data on regards lockdown, but in regards to regions of Scotland, in the stratified survey we undertook, you're at a higher risk of dog attacks if you're in Lothian or East Central Scotland, with a 28% prevalence in each of those areas, and fewer attacks in the northeast of Scotland. So the prevalence in the northeast of Scotland was 8%.
Okay. Emma.
It's a final question, convener, and I thank you for allowing me to ask my questions. When we explored the drafting about seizing a dog and taking it to a vet, we also used the language that a vet actually might be on site already examining sheep or attending to injuries. And so the arranging for a dog to be examined by a vet doesn't necessarily mean taking a dog to a veterinary practice. It might mean the same vet on site of an offence is actually attending a dog to take evidence. So, and what we were thinking at that time was an antiemetic to make the dog sick to get some wool, or even using swabs for comparing blood analysis in a dog's mouth versus the sheep. So I guess, does that language need to be clarified? Because taking a dog to a vet or having a vet assess a dog doesn't necessarily mean that it has to go to a veterinary practice.
Fiona.
Just say that for vets in practice, they would need just training and clear guidelines of what was expected of them and who was asking them to undertake that. So currently, if there's already a vet on site, the farmer presumably has called that vet there to attend to the sheep. So currently, that's at the cost of the farmer. Maybe a fine is an appropriate detriment to the dog owners.
Alan, do you want to answer anything on that?
Yeah, I think in a lot of instances, obviously the first port of call, particularly if a farmer or livestock owner sees its animal suffering, to be contacting a vet to come out. So a lot of evidence gathering can be done at the scene. But again, a lot of it will ultimately come down to finance. Does the vet bill the farmer? And initially the farmer, landowner, livestock owner have to then initially outlay to cover the vet's costs, looking to then maybe get some sort of compensation further down the line.
Okay, Emma, does that answer your questions?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, convener. It's given me a lot to think about already this morning. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. Just before we go, I'd like to ask a question directly to Fiona. I know farmers who avoid using pastures because there are areas where they know people walk dogs and where there are likely to be dog attacks. I also know farmers who bring sheep in the evening because they're worried about the sheep being left at night. Have you got any evidence of that which may suggest that there's extra work being undertaken by farmers to try and mitigate any potential attacks?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing, we asked people what measures they currently employed to cope with dog attacks. And then we asked them the percentage they thought it had been effective and which they thought had been ineffective. So 52% talked to the dog owners, 60% thought that it was affected, 30% thought it wasn't affected. Putting up signs was one thing, but moving sheep to a different area was the highest, the thing that they thought was the most effective, i.e. use another area because that's a dangerous pasture because of dog attacks. So 22% of farmers currently move sheep to a different area. Out of that, 72% think that's effective, 19% didn't. So, but that was the highest in what farmers thought was the most effective thing they could do. In some of the, we asked a lot of questions about emotive impact. One of the things farmers really disliked was the conflict or the speaking to a dog owner and having aggressive, you know, often the dog owner's very upset or angry, and the farmer is worried how they react when they themselves are emotionally very distressed or their family are. It's quite a fraught period of time.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And I'm looking around. I don't think there are any other questions. So I would like to thank the panel for all the evidence that they've given. Fiona, Alan and Kirstine, thank you very much for the time you've given to the committee. We are now going to have a brief suspension of 5 minutes to allow the panels to change over. We will reconvene at, let's say, 10:25. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back to this meeting of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. Could I just take a moment to remind members present to ensure that their mobile phones are on silent. I'd like to welcome the second panel, which consists of the following organisations who represent dogs owners and countryside access interests. First of all, Mike Flynn, who's a Chief Superintendent with the Scottish SPCA. Steve Jenkinson, who's the Access and Countryside Advisor for the Kennel Club. Paula Boyden, who is the Director of the Dogs Trust. And Bridget Jones, who's the Strategic Paths and Projects Manager for Nature Scott. Could I just say to witnesses, if you want to come in, because there's 4 of you, could you indicate in the chat room on the facilities that you want to come in, and then I can make sure that I bring you in, because I won't get a chance to bring all 4 of you in on every single question. And also, as I said to the other witnesses, if you could just keep an eye on me as well, because if you go off on too much of a tangent, I might wiggle my pen at you to bring you back onto track. So the first question is from John Finney, who is remotely attending this meeting. So John Finney, yours is the first question.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener, and good morning, panel. Convener, I'm conscious that the nature of the questions I posed last time brought lengthy answers, so perhaps I'll try and combine the question, if I may, the 2 questions asked previously. And I'm sure witnesses were listening in, so they'll know that it is that I would like to know, please, and this is in a number of parts, in your professional experience, what your assessment of the scale and nature of the problem of protecting livestock is. Do we have enough evidence to make an accurate assessment of that and how it should be addressed? Is there a need for new legislation? And if there's evidence gaps, how we overcome those, please? Maybe to Mr. Flynn first, please.
Thank you, John. Mike.
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Finney. Good morning, Convener. Thank you for inviting the Scottish SPC along. I think if you look at the previous session and the evidence from Fiona Lovett, that was a very good survey that was carried out, which purely shows that, as we've always known, it's a totally underreported incident that happens. Many farmers just don't see the point. The owner will never be traced. And again, going back to insurance, a lot of them will not claim on the insurance for fear of their premiums going up. So I do believe it's widely underreported.
Thank you for that. Steve Jenkinson, do you want to come in? Steve.
Yeah, good morning, panel. Thank you. I mean, it's not something that we keep data on ourselves, but we are very mindful, as we pointed out in our submission, of the huge disparity between some of the data. But at the end of the day, you know, one incident is one too many. And full disclosure, on my agricultural holding here in Orkney, I've been a victim of livestock worrying too and had my animals killed. And the fact that, you know, it may happen more or less frequently really isn't an issue. We need to be focusing on, you know, the victims and the farmer. But given that, and at the time, it's very easy to feel, you know, vengeful and we want penalties and these sort of things. But when the police came and asked me what I wanted to happen, I just wanted it not to happen again. And I wanted it to stop. And so my focus in terms of advising the Kennel Club and generally is that figures about how often it happens are interesting, but actually knowing why it happens is what's going to give us the best interventions to change things. Because we've heard 2 particular threads already, that one, there's free-ranging dogs, which dogs that escape from home and all sorts of things, which make up about half, and also walkers with dogs and when they're out. And the key thing is the interventions to deal with those are very, very different. And when we say that, you know, there's a lot of talk about having greater penalties will be a better deterrent and make clear that your dog killing sheep or whatever is unacceptable. I'm not aware of any dog owner who's ever thought it was acceptable. They may be misguided and not understand that, say, a dog running around in a field of sheep of in-lamb ewes can cause them to abort. So whilst on one hand, there's bits of legislation for repeat, reckless, willful offenders is useful, but actually in terms of coming back to the numbers, towards the numbers is actually more about why it's happening and getting the right interventions, rather than arguing about, you know, the huge disparity between the figures. We still need to do something, but for us it's doing the right thing, and we're not sure that pure numbers like that are actually going to help us get the right interventions to help those individual farmers who've suffered.
Okay, I'm
Can
going
I
to
ask
ask...
you, believe so, Convener, I wonder if Mr Jenkinson could express a view on whether he feels there's a need for new legislation in light of what he said, please, and maybe the other witnesses as well, please.
Yes, thank you for that question. I mean, it follows on from that, really, that certainly, and because of my holding, I'm a National Farmers Union of Scotland member as well. In terms of where we've got dog control notices, you know, when those have been used, NFUS reports that they're useful. And then the great thing about those is that they can really deal with what the problem is, why it's happened. So, for example, if it's that a dog has escaped, then that can require people to keep their boundaries correctly, or if their children were walking their dog and weren't doing it responsibly, it can deal with that. So you can target those specific measures to deal with the problem. And so, on one hand, it will be hard to say people who willfully, you know, cause sheep worrying, whoever they may be, and if it does happen, a very, very small minority. In terms of the legislation, if I'm really honest, there's nothing to specifically oppose greater penalties per se, but it just seems a missed opportunity to actually deal with the causes. Because, for example, if we say, I don't know, a pedestrian was killed by a driver who'd come off a bend in the road, you would clearly feel that wouldn't have happened if that person wasn't driving that car. But then we don't just say, well, we'll penalise the driver, because it could have been bad road design, there could have been a fault in the car, you know, the person could have been drink driving, there could have been all sorts of reasons, and we deal with the reasons why it's happening. So, to be honest, my interest is just seeing the issue not happen as much, if at all, to people like me and lots of other farmers. And just in terms of focusing on penalties and thinking that's a big deterrent, what could be a bigger deterrent than your much-loved family animal being shot? So it would just be nice if we're going to have some legislation for that to really focus on making a difference. And that's really I guess, the disappointment, that it's great that members brought this forward, but it just seems a missed opportunity to actually make a real difference by dealing with actually the underlying causes.
Thank you. And John, I would like to bring in on your behalf Bridget, followed by Paula. So Bridget, if you'd like to go now.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, from first part of the question about scale of the issue and the evidence, we don't hold data specifically on these kind of incidents. However, we do get feedback through the local access forum meetings with our national access forum, and behavioural issues around dog ownership and responsible access do get raised on a fairly regular basis, it would be fair to say. And I think in terms of evidence, you know, any evidence that's out there is very useful for us, particularly as a large part of our work is encouraging responsible behaviour and encouraging compliance with the Scottish Outdoor Access Code. So, you know, that aspect's pretty important. With regard to the need for the legislation, yes, I think it could do with being updated. I think as other folk have said, just in terms of definitions around livestock would be useful, and perhaps bringing it into this century. But we do see the role of enforcement as being one element of how to help manage people's enjoyment of the outdoors, and management and education are important, as important, if not more so, in ensuring prevention.
Okay, thank you. Paula.
Thank you very much. I think in terms of the evidence, I think we accept that you know, livestock crime is underreported. And I think in terms of us being able to move forward, first and foremost, we need good, robust recording and reporting. And what I mean by that is standardised recording of injuries. And we're very encouraged to hear that the Partnership Against Rural Crime is recording all incidents. But and it's great that Scotland has a single police force, which makes life a lot easier. But certainly what we're seeing, for example, from reports from the National Police Chiefs Council, is that there's a huge variation, and we need to make sure that that is standardised. One, so that we know what we're dealing with, but also to give us a baseline so that should this legislation move forward, we can actually assess whether it's being beneficial or not. Obviously, the reporting at the moment focuses on the numbers, but the other thing we need to perhaps look at is the actual impact, so to the level of suffering that's been encountered by the farm, which I think is an area that we do need to look at. Do we need new legislation? I would agree that yes, we do. I think the current legislation is outdated in terms of the penalties, in terms of the species covered. But again, I agree with the other panellists that this is only one part of it, and the challenge with this legislation is its primary impact is after the event has happened. So we do need to look at prevention. So as was mentioned, whether it's education, whether it's management, but we do need to look a little bit broader to see if we can actually stop these incidents happening in the first place.
Thank you.
Many thanks indeed.
John, I think Stuart wants to come in. I'm very happy to come back to you after Stuart's come in, if there's further questions you'd like to ask.
I think it's covered. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you, John. Stuart, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, and I suspect my question probably might be for Paula Boyden. And it's just a simple one. Are you able to give us some sense of what proportion of the dog population in Scotland or in the UK is represented by Huskies and Alsatians or German Shepherds?
Thank you. Sadly, we don't have that data. The question of even how many dogs are in Scotland is a matter of question. The most, the current figures we have is from the Pet Food Manufacturers Association, who do an annual survey, and their estimate is that there's over 700,000 dogs in Scotland. The one thing I would say is a word of caution in terms of we've heard that the most prevalent breeds appear to be Huskies and German Shepherds. But I would just suggest, is it that it is actually Huskies and German Shepherds that are more prone to this activity, or is it a reflection of the sorts of owners that these dogs have that are actually attacking livestock? So I think we do have to just have an air of caution in focusing on these particular breeds.
Mike, I think you wanted to come back in on a point that has been raised in that answer as well.
Yeah, just back to the previous bit and what the gentleman was saying. Obviously, we're here not just to represent dogs, but all animals in Scotland. And having actually witnessed some sheep attacks, it can be absolutely horrendous. I think what people have got to remember is we've been doing education on this for at least 30 years. And I know Alan Drawn's group have been doing it fervently over the last couple, along with the National Sheep Association. What you've got to remember is practically 90% of all these attacks are totally preventable. There's a basic premise in law: you're not allowed to let your dog stray, and if you've got a dog, it must be kept under control. So if everybody's got their dog under control, this would not happen. And where it does happen, sometimes it is inadvertent, but there are repeat offenders. So I'm fully supportive of Emma Harper's bill that we've got to have some kind of sustainable penalty. The only time I see attacks going down in a region is when a farmer's taking action into his own hand and actually killed a dog, which he's perfectly entitled to do if it's attacking his livestock. And that seems to bring the prevalence down for a while in that area. But to see somebody getting a £50 fine and their dog back means nothing to anyone.
Okay. Sorry, Mike, are you wanting to come in on that? Okay. Fine. John, does that raise further points, or are you happy with the questions you've raised?
I wonder, and this is a bit off script, Convener, but maybe to Mr. Flynn, accepting that legislation is about how we control how humans behave, is there ever a situation where perhaps as an aberration from a dog, I don't know, a brain tumour or something, that the behaviour wouldn't be predictable? I appreciate that you would say, well, in any case, the dog should be under control, but I wonder if Mr. Flynn had a comment on that, because that's a view I've heard expressed.
Yeah, well, I mean, there could be a veterinary reason, and that is one example that a veterinary surgeon examination would be good. But again, if it's under control, it doesn't matter if it's on a kind of mini stroke, it's not going to make any difference to that individual dog. I can think of a couple of occasions in my 34 years with the Society where an owner has lost a dog, it's strayed, and they've done literally everything to try and get that dog back, informed the police, ourselves and dog wardens. I'm thinking of one in West Lothian. It took us 3 weeks to put a live trap out to catch this dog, and it had been worrying sheep, but everybody was trying everything. but some other people, their dog goes out, they just don't care. It's down to irresponsible ownership.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, John. The next questions are from Richard Lau. Richard.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, panel. Can I ask, do you think that the new bill as drafted will help to reduce the instances of livestock worrying, and could it be improved, or can it be improved to make it more effective?
Paula, would you like to start off on that one?
Yes, thank you. I would certainly anticipate it will reduce incidents. It's certainly with increased penalties and the realisation that this is not a victimless crime. That the impacts are huge on the farming community, and one would hope that with some maybe some high-profile cases that just show the impact and just the losses incurred, and I don't mean just financial, that it should ultimately be a salutary message to those irresponsible dog owners who are allowing their dogs to stray.
Steve, you wanted to come in on that.
Could I ask Steve for...
Sorry, Richard. Steve has indicated he wanted to come in. Can I bring him in and then I'll come back to you?
Yes, I was wanting... Yeah. Steve?
Yeah. Thank you, convener. There was a question about the dog breeds, which I was just going to come back on. Again, the point, like Paula Boyden made, that the kennel clubs use that any dog can be a problem. So looking at specific breeds can be a bit of a red herring. But just out of interest, in terms of German Shepherds, that's in terms of the registry of pedigree dogs, and the number 8 most frequent dog registered in the last year. Huskies aren't in the top 20, but there were 397 husky puppies registered last year. Coming to in terms of how we can change or how the legislation can help. Again, thinking of the 2 reasons why these things happen, we know from studies that have been done elsewhere that have eliminated sheep worrying on sites that have been very heavily used by dog walkers. Good information to help dog owners avoid conflict is key. For those people who are going out walking their dogs, they want to have a happy, healthy, hassle-free walk. Nobody's going out with the intention thinking, I hate sheep or whatever it may be. And we know on sites, particularly local authority sites and other sites, where people have either turned up and either they've seen, if you go signage, credible signage that says if you go this way there's sheep, this way there isn't, people will choose the least hassle option. Now that information needs to be credible and timely, but we've seen on sites where the graziers were going to take their animals away because of the frequency of livestock worrying. In those instances, when people turned up at the car park, there was good information provided that dealt with it. But we do know there's a problem when people say, oh, we use signage, and being mindful that the National Farmers Union Mutual Insurer says that only 27% of farmers are using signage anyway. If you've got a sign that's just left up all year saying sheep or lambs in field, and people have gone past that 3 or 4 times and there's no livestock there, people ignore the signage just as much as you see the signage if you're going down the M9 or whatever and it says roadworks ahead and you don't see any. But we know for 85% of dog walkers, exercising their dog off lead is the single most important thing for them. Now, that doesn't in any way justify livestock worrying, but it's also, we need to remember that walking your dog is one of the top 2 lifestyle factors for keeping people active and healthy in Scotland. So what we need to do is help people have good choices about where if their dog's happy on the walk, they're going to walk more. So we don't need to suppress that, but we need to help them make good choices. And whilst one could take a principled approach and say, well, actually, and dogs should always be under control in the countryside because they're a danger to themselves, let alone other people. But when we see other types of rural crime, like theft, all sorts of things, and I've been to the events that Spark run and Alan Dron and others, where they're saying, well, yes, for example, rural theft happens. These are things you can do to prevent this happening on your land. And we feel equally there needs to be a partnership approach here with the bodies actually helping the farmers and providing the right information to help people. Because, again, nobody in terms of the walkers intentionally is going out. Just turning to the 50% of dogs free roaming, we think there is a real issue to raise awareness, because often I'll speak to dog owners and they'll say, oh, well, he's a country dog or he's a rural dog or he's a crofter's dog or whatever. He goes away, he comes back, he doesn't cause any harm, where actually, they don't know. So reporting dogs that are free ranging to the local authority and getting a dog control notice is good. Thank you, convener.
Steve, can I ask
Richard.
you, before I go to my second question, thank you, convener. On the Kennel Club, the Kennel Club is the most respected organisation. I previously had 2 Yorkshire Terriers and previously was a dog owner. Can you tell me, does the Scottish Kennel Club have anything on their website that talks about sheep worrying or because I certainly can't find anything. You know, what's the Kennel Club's position? Do they try to inform people who have dogs about this situation? You know, because as I say, I don't see it on the Scottish Kennel Club website.
Steve.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sorry, thank you, convener. Yeah, I mean, in terms of I'm acting on behalf of the Kennel Club, but the Scottish Kennel Club come on board with that. But the key thing for us is knowing that this is an issue for all dogs, not just people with pedigree dogs. So where we focus our attention on in Scotland is working with the National Access Forum. And one of the key things that we've done is making sure that the information is clearer, because often we'll talk, even today, about worrying or whatever. Our message has always been about it's not acceptable for dogs to approach livestock or wildlife. And in the pack, the SPICE summary, it brings forward from Nature Scott the work that had been done to give very clear 3 bullet point messages in terms of helping people understand what is a problem. So we feel it's an issue of a joint approach, because to be honest, the traffic that's driven to our websites, we need to take it to people wanting to go out for a walk and things like that, not just necessarily they may have a pedigree or non-pedigree dog. So I hope that helps. And if in the SPICE pack there are those wordings that were agreed by ourselves, National Farmers Union, Spark, and those are things we want to push out because there's recognition that the wording has been too woolly, it hasn't been cleared, and we're completely behind that.
Bridget, do you want to come in on that?
So you can maybe ask them to update their website. What is your understanding, to yourself, Steve, and other members of the panel, what is your understanding of the most common circumstances around livestock worrying?
Would you like me to go again, convener? I'm aware I'm speaking.
Well, I'm quite keen for somebody else to come in, if I may. I was keen to bring Bridget in, and then probably Paula, and then come back to you, Steve, if I may. And if I could just remind all witnesses, is if you keep an eye on me, I think I said at the previous panel, I tend to waggle my pen when I think that I want to bring somebody else in to give everyone a fair crack of the whip. So the other option is to cut the microphones, which I really object to doing. But let's try with Bridget first and then go to Paula.
Okay. Yeah, firstly, just to pick up on the information for the public about responsible behaviour and dog ownership. The Scottish Outdoor Access Code and associated websites got all that information on it, and as Steve alluded to, most of that advice, in fact all of that advice, is done in collaboration with either National Farmers Union, Scottish Land and Estates, Spark, Kennel Club, and so on, to ensure we get really good messages out there that work. And the type of information we've got there takes all sorts of forms, from posters, signage options, there's training videos on there, all sorts of things to encourage responsible dog ownership and behaviour in the outdoors. So yeah, do please look at that resource, and we do various campaigns as part of that, some of which have been incorporated in some of the COVID-19 campaign work that we've been doing, encouraging responsible behaviour as part of relaxation and getting out for your daily exercise, and dog messages are in there as well. And then we've had various campaigns over the years, particularly focusing on lambing, which really, I think, brings me to the point that was asked there about, what are the most common issues. I think from our perspective, lambing time is probably the biggest situation that we're asked to sort of help advise and raise awareness about. So those months in the early part of the year, January through to kind of, even as far as sort of June, July time, and prior to lambing actually taking place with pregnant ewes on the hill or in the field as well. So that's probably enough from me.
Okay, Paula.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I think one of the key things to bear in mind as well is, as we heard from Spark, that 50% of the incidents they've recorded, there is no owner present, so the dog is on its own. And certainly figures from the NPCC, the National Police Chiefs Council, their 4-year survey suggested that figure was as high as 2/3, with some police forces being even higher. So I think this is something that we really need to look at is, why are these dogs unaccompanied, in terms of, clearly, as one of the previous witnesses said, we can have good signage, but if the owner isn't there, how do we manage that? What's actually happening to allow these dogs to roam free? Are they escaping from gardens? Are owners literally just letting them out of the front door? And that's something that, that there's a huge area there that we can aim to try and prevent some of these incidents happening.
Steve, I'm happy to bring you in brief.
That's me, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, Steve, I think wanted to come in briefly.
No, I think everybody else has covered it. I think that the key thing is being aware of why it happened and then have the right interventions for those. And the fact that, fines and huge fines is actually only going to be is a small part of that story. Significant, but, we really want to stop it happening rather than deal with people after the event.
Richard.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay. Richard, are you content?
I'm fine, Convener. Thank you.
Okay. Colin, I think you've got some questions you want to ask. Colin.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning to the panel. Some of the evidence that the committee has received on the bill has highlighted the need to better enforce existing measures. So could I ask the panel whether or not they believe increased use of dog control notices in the cases of livestock worrying would be beneficial? And I suppose allied to that, are there any other methods that need to be better employed to ensure that any legislation that is passed by Parliament will be effective?
Paula, would you like to head off on that, and then I'll probably come to Bridget.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I absolutely agree with the question. I think dog control notices are something that could really be used in these incidences. However, to enable that, I think a couple of things need to happen. We need make sure there's good communication between local authorities and the police, but also we need a means of being able to trace dogs. So if a dog is issued with a dog control notice in one particular local authority area, what happens if that dog, either the owner or the dog strays out of area? How do we know that there is a control notice imposed upon that dog? So I think with some administrative support, then absolutely they can be used to much better effect.
Okay, Bridget, followed by Mike.
Yeah, I'll probably pick up on sort of non-legislative approaches. I won't talk about education and awareness raising side of things, but the management measures. And I think encouraging the use of good, current and relevant and attractive signage to ensure that the public are aware of whatever's ahead of them, whether it's lambs in a field or new livestock in a field or whatever. It has been mentioned already, but I can't overemphasize the importance of good information, because dog walkers do tend to be quite habitual. They use regular routes, and that sort of dog walking circuit, can be a daily, twice daily feature of their activity. So they're quite a good audience to be able to kind of pinpoint and target to get messages across to. The other thing is that they do like to stay away from livestock. They are looking for that easy, enjoyable walk. So if you're looking at kind of management measures, ensuring that the paths are there, or alternative routes if you've got lambing happening in a field, and good information about that. Good fencing arrangements, good gate arrangements, working with your access authorities, that's your local authority, your national park authority, their access officers, and potentially with your local community. There might be a community path group in your area that may be able to help perhaps with funding for new path arrangements and that kind of thing. So I think there is another aspect to this that can help land managers manage the issue with some support, potentially even with funding. Okay,
Mike, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Convener. I think I'm going to go back to what Kirsten said from Perth in the previous one. Yes, control of dog notices can be very effective, but with no disrespect to anybody that's involved in dealing with it, they are grossly understaffed and underfunded. And there are certain local authorities that do not have an appointed person. They're working for a different department and then they get put onto issuing a dog control notice. I do know it's either in Aberdeen or Aberdeenshire that if the police charge somebody with a dog worrying offence, they will issue a control notice. But that's not a joined up thing. There is not enough coordination going. And there's so many crosses in legislation. If it's an unattended dog at the time, technically that's a stray dog. Signed in as a stray dog, it's out of the system in 7 days. And that's legally binding. So there's lots of legislation that could be used, but it's just not currently adopted.
Okay, and Steve, do you want to come in briefly on that?
Yes, Convener. Yeah, just to reaffirm that the value of dog control notices are really good, particularly because of this balance between criminal law and civil law. So in terms of taking preventative action, particularly where the incident happened unintentionally, can be sufficient, rather than going down the criminal path. And the fact that they're preventative. But the reality is, if we're saying that whoever doesn't have the resources to issue dog control notices, which can be done in a much quicker, easier way because of how they're constructed, then how are these criminal sanctions going to be applied to? Because somebody's going to need to use the resources to investigate and take action. And that's time that's spent after the incident has happened rather than preventively before it's happened.
Okay, thank you. Colin, I think you said that you're satisfied with that. So some questions from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Convener, and good morning, folks. I mean, we've strayed a wee bit into it already, but I mean, we all know that, and as far as this crime is concerned, prevention is better than cure. We have spoken a wee bit, or some of the panel have spoken a wee bit about better signage and better information, but what about improved training for dogs and dog owners? What do you think that should look like, and how might a higher level of training be ensured, given that we've already heard from, I think it was Steve, I think it was, no, it wasn't, it doesn't matter. We've already heard that for the last 30 years or so, we've been trying to train owners and dogs better, and yet the problem still exists. So what can we do better as far as training dogs and their owners to ensure that these crimes become less?
Mike, do you want to head off on that?
Yeah, it's down to education. And as I say, we've been trying that for over 30 years. Before COVID came in, our education officers spoke to over 240,000 children throughout Scotland. And in our livestock section, we talk about the dangers of dogs not being under control. Education's always the key part here, but some people just don't believe that their dog would do it. And Paula and Steve is right. You can't really focus on German Shepherds and Huskies. Any dog of any decent size has got the capability of doing that. And I've known many people. I remember one lady many years ago, she had walked the exact same dog around all the different same fields for 8 years, and one day it just took off. She was absolutely appalled. She actually went to the farmer to report it herself, and that was a very responsible person. But she was devastated, but she had no inclination her dog would do that, and then one day it decided, and that might come back to a previous point, something might have been physically wrong with that dog. So no, education is key, and we would like to think if this is implemented, it would be implemented along with a nationwide campaign to highlight the potential dangers and that the penalties are now severe and that you could lose your dog. As I say, currently a farmer under the right circumstances can destroy a dog if he can't control it and it is harrying his sheep.
Okay, Steve, followed by Paula.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Again, people, I think, are really usefully making the point about this being an unintentional crime, so education is really key. It's interesting, there was one of the cantons in Switzerland that required people, just as with the driving test, to actually go on to a dog ownership test before they could get a dog. And one of my colleagues who I was studying the psychology of people at the pets and the pets at Southampton University looked at that, but actually there was no net benefit in essence. But the people who are going to be good dog owners were still good dog owners, and the ones you can go on the test, but it doesn't mean you necessarily do it. But certainly education is key, particularly because, not to undermine the value of sheep, but actually often these things are symptoms of poor dog welfare and dog keeping as well. You know, they're symptomatic of a wider issue. And certainly through our Good Citizen training scheme, which operates all across the UK and extensively through Scotland, we're actually developing new modules which are outdoor ones, because often dog training happens inside where there's not many sheep and deer, but actually training outside can be really valuable. But again, it's a key thing that once we see those symptoms, the dog has strayed or there's been an incident, let's deal with that straight away, and dog control notices can really do that quite swiftly.
Can I just ask Steve if he feels that the increased penalties that are coming along with this bill is part of the solution as well? Because you make the point very strongly that nobody wants it to happen, but the fact that the penalties will be increased, will that not get back to the general dog owner and say that they realise that this is a real crime? So that it is about education, as you say, but it's also about the penalty that goes with allowing it to happen. So do you accept that the penalty need to increase as well?
Certainly penalties need to be there, because there is an element, and often these are the people who are not looking after their dogs in lots of other ways, that it needs to be there. But I think relying on the penalty is maybe just a tad naive, that it needs to be part of a suite of measures. And I mean, sentencing guidelines, I think, will be really important here, because if you've got somebody where the problems happened willfully or recklessly, then that's really important. But we do need the penalties, and it's good to extend it to all the other animals, because no animal should suffer, from an attack by a dog. But actually, I think it would just be better if this was more integrated in preventative measures, and the penalties were used as a last case for willful people who've repeated events have occurred.
Okay, Paula, followed by Bridget.
Thank you. So certainly, obviously, education is absolutely key to this. I think what we need to do is to try and encourage folks that training their dog is the norm. We come across a lot of dog owners who, because they've had a dog before, feel they don't need to go to any sort of training classes. I sit here not only for Dogs Trust, but I am a veterinary surgeon myself. If I could give you a tablet to make your dog behave, you would willingly give it. But because training takes time, it takes effort, some people perhaps either don't have the time or don't have the inclination to put that effort in as soon as they can when they get a dog. So I think that's something that we really need to focus on. And this is why we've set up a dog school to try and encourage folks for that. It's not just for puppy owners, but anybody who has just got a dog, and you won't be surprised to hear that a number of the dogs that come into our care do have underlying behavioural issues, because again, it's that time and effort that it takes to try and address and resolve those issues. So I can't underemphasise the importance of training, but sitting alongside that, and I appreciate it's left of field for this forum, we do need to look at regulation of the whole world of dog training and behaviour to make sure that, again, that the dogs are appropriately treated and we're not negatively impacting their welfare by what we're trying to do in terms of the training process.
Thank you. And Bridget.
Yeah, just briefly, I think others have covered this quite well, but yes, training is an important component part of improving people's understanding of what they need to do, and just, I guess, more integrated content, perhaps the trick here, ensuring that there's an understanding of what access rights and responsibilities are, and perhaps a better understanding of land use in Scotland. I think there's possibly an opportunity just to ensure that the public learn a bit more about what goes on in the countryside in terms of land management and land use, and just a wider understanding, which would be for everybody's benefit, but in this case, particularly for people with dogs.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Oliver, I think you've got some questions. Oliver.
I do, Convener. I think penalties have probably been quite comprehensively covered, but I also wanted to ask the panel what their views were on requiring compensation to livestock owners. Okay,
interesting question. Therefore, I tell you, we'll go to Paula. Start off that, if you wouldn't mind. Then we'll go to Steve, and then we'll go to Mike. Paula.
Thank you. I agree that there should be an element of compensation. This is somebody's livelihood, as I mentioned previously. The cost is clearly, it is financial, but it goes much wider than that in terms of the emotional impact on the farmer. You may have a farmer who it's not just the financial loss of those sheep, but if he spent years building up a pedigree flock, it might be a closed flock. He's not going to be able to resolve that overnight, and that there's all the subsequent losses. There's the immediate losses of animals that have been killed, animals that have been seriously injured that either need treating or euthanizing, but the subsequent losses of, for example, abortion in ewes and the such like that we really need to look at. So I agree that there should be compensation. It would make sense to look at that at the time that a case comes to court, and this goes back to one of my previous comments about understanding the level of suffering that's been incurred by those animals, so that you can have a full view of the impact of a particular incident, and therefore it should be proportionate in that situation.
Okay, thank you. I think I said Steve next, did I? If I didn't, that's who's coming next. Sorry, I apologise. Steve.
That's all right, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a people problem. It isn't a dog problem. It's quite reasonable for people, farmers, to be compensated for the problem, but also, along with the compensation, good action to make sure that the incident doesn't happen again. And that's it.
Okay. Bridget, do you have views on that?
I just agree. Compensation seems sensible.
And Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Yeah, compensation is a very important aspect. There's all the financial costs there, but you can only get compensation from someone that can afford to pay it. We've got personal experience of that through the 2006 Act. And I would like to see that all reasonable costs by the enforcement agency can be recouped from the accused person, if they're found guilty. You've heard both from the police and the local authority, they've not got the financial resource. If it's a person that is willfully doing it, if you leave the dog with them, it's likely to happen again. If you seize that dog, you're talking about £15 per dog per day for kennelling costs, and you can take up to a year to get to court. Local authorities and the police simply can't afford that.
Oliver.
Convener.
Okay, just on the compensation, should there be limits? Because we heard Stuart Stevenson suggested that TUPs could be worth, and they are, in excess of £300,000. A breeding ewe could be worth £7,000 or £8,000. It's unlikely farmers will have them individually insured, because insurance runs probably at 20% of the value of the animal, which makes it prohibitive. Do you think that there should be a limit on how much compensation farmers should have, or should it be mandatory for dog owners to have insurance to cover the costs of potential damage by their animals? Just be interested in your views on that, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to my previous answer. You can set any limit you want. If the person has not got the means to pay it, then it's not going to be paid. And to be fair to the owner and the dog, that dog doesn't know if he's attacking a £30,000 tup or something that Alan Drawn can find for £70. But as far as I'm concerned, if it's a person's neglect that's caused it, if they can afford to pay the farmer the full value, then that should happen.
Okay. Thank you. I've got a further question here. If an inspecting body is to be appointed to assist investigating livestock worrying cases, who, in your view, would be the most appropriate, and what additional training do you think they would need? Perhaps we'd come to Bridget to start off with on that.
I'm going to duck this one, I think. I'll leave it to others, if that's okay.
Okay, shoulder shrug there. Mike, probably back to you first of all then to start with, and I'll widen it out if necessary.
Yeah, thank you very much, Convener. As hopefully the panel will know, all of our inspectors are authorised under the 2006 Act to police the welfare provisions. So we've got the exact same authority as the police, except for arrest and stopping a vehicle. We've made it plain in our submission to this, we do not want to be the primary enforcer of it, and just because of location and everything. But I can assure you, we have never ever refused a request from the police to assist them. But they are the primary reporters of this to the Crown Office. and we will continue to assist the police in any way we can, and the local authorities if they become involved.
I'm not seeing anyone else wanting to come in, and I've got myself confused, for which I apologise to Mr Stevenson. I should have taken him before my question, so I apologise, Stuart, and I'd come to you now.
Thank you, Convener. Apology full accepted, but not also necessary, I hasten to add. We've been talking about dog control notices. I now want to talk about human control notices, because I think it's just been said by Steve that it's a people problem, not a dog's problem, and I think that's easy to agree with. So the first part of my questioning is, are the order-making powers to disqualify owners from owning dogs appropriate and proportionate? And if not, how could they be improved? And I draw panel members' attention to the observations made by the previous panel that enforcement in rural areas is significantly difficult. And I didn't find myself fundamentally disagreeing with that. Three people in the whole of Perthshire being one example. An awful lot of ground to cover and not many people.
I guess let's try Paula on that, followed by Steve. Paula.
Thank you. In terms of banning an owner from keeping a dog, I think there is scope for that. It has to be proportionate to clearly perhaps the first-time offender whose dog has literally escaped because of an error. I think that would be disproportionate, but particularly if, for example, one has repeat offenders who clearly don't see the gravity of what's happened, then there should be the option for that. But we have these challenges already, obviously, and Mike will know more about this than I do. We have individuals, members of the public, who are banned from keeping animals under the Animal Welfare Act, and it's a similar process. It's always going to be a challenge to enforce a ban. Understanding from some of my colleagues that I work with in the RSPCA, quite often people will actually report individuals in, so we have to a degree rely on that goodwill, but I don't underestimate the challenges of it at all. But I think the important thing is it must be proportionate, in that again, I appreciate it's south of the border, but the National Police Chiefs survey of that particular survey over 4 years, 11% of the dogs involved in that were repeat offenders. So it's a minority, but I think we should at least have the ability for somebody who's completely indiscriminate about allowing their dog to roam.
Thank you. Steve.
Thank you, Convener. To follow on what Paula said, absolutely, we need these things to be proportionate. But also, I think we need to make sure we're dealing with the issue, because earlier on it was said in the previous session that, oh, if you go to the house and the dog's in the house, then you know who the owner is. Well, you don't. You don't know who the keeper is, because we see this in other dangerous dogs legislation. Actually, who owns the dog and who you take the action against is really quite difficult. And if you banned one person, the dog could be just transferred to the same household, and the issues that relate to why that dog escaped in the first place have gone unresolved. Or they may just dispose of the dog to actually an even less suitable home. So if there's an issue where the sheep worrying is symptomatic of poor welfare for the dog, then it's in the dog's interests for that dog to be removed. But if it's just for issues where a gate was left open or a child did something or whatever it is, and the person has behaved in all respects reasonably, but life catches up with us in some cases, and that will be inappropriate. So I think a key issue here are the sentencing guidelines to make sure these powers are used proportionately. And to come back to my point at the start, when I was asked by the police what I wanted to happen, focusing on what's the best thing to do to stop it happening again. And just that dog going to live somewhere else isn't necessarily going to deal with that. It could make it worse.
And Mike, you've spoken strongly about this. Do you want to add in here?
Yeah, I mean, luckily under the current system, doesn't matter what the legislation says, it'll ultimately be up to the sheriff that's dealing with the case, individual case, to decide on the individual merits. So if it's somebody a first-time offender, totally innocent, it was a pure accident, that's one thing. But if it's a repeat offender or someone that is so reckless and they give no regard to what's happened, then that's a ban should come in. And it's not just a ban on ownership, It's a ban on ownership, keeping or being under control. So if you just say, oh no, the dog now belongs to my wife, but I'm caught in control of it in the open air, then I'm breaking that ban. So it has to encompass everything.
Okay, Stuart, do you want to come back on that?
I want to just move on to the next bit, but I see
think
there may be someone
Peter's
else.
got a related question, so I might bring Peter in and come back to you, Stuart, if I may. Peter.
Well, I do have actually. I mean, I just wonder what the panel thinks if when or ever should a dog be destroyed. You know, that we do know that a dog, having attacked livestock, got a taste for blood, is fairly likely to do it again if it gets the opportunity. And we've heard that in the case of repeat offenders, that the dog could or should be seized. But I wonder what happens to that dog at that stage. If that dog has been seized because it has repeatedly attacked livestock, what should happen to that dog at that point? Should it be destroyed is my question, basically.
Mike, I'm going to keep on you on this, and then I'm going to come to the others. Again,
it would be on an individual basis. We get dogs from many circumstances that are just dangerous dogs and whatever. And then it's assessed by our staff, veterinary surgeons, animal behaviourists. And if you look at, as I said earlier, the majority of these attacks are totally preventable. So if it's just keeping the dog under proper control would prevent it being destroyed, then that could happen. So it wouldn't be an automatic thing.
Do you want to come in on that? I'm not sure what's happened there. Steve, are you there?
Yeah, I am. I just didn't catch the first word, convener. But yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it comes back to the point that Paula made as well, that any dog can cause sheep worrying. So just because it hasn't happened before doesn't mean it couldn't, because we know that a dog just playing in a field of inland ewes and not causing any physical damage to them can cause those animals to abort. And when the owner says, oh, the dog was only playing, well, it may well have been, but the consequence is really severe. So to say that just because a dog's done it once should be a life sentence for the dog, to me would be excessive and inappropriate, because as Mike says, this is a preventable crime, and you know we need to look at the wider issues. But certainly, I would much rather see if it's an unsuitable home because of sheep worrying and the welfare of the dog being compromised in other ways, and the dog being taken away from that home would seem appropriate. But just to destroy the dog, as was said earlier, this is a people problem, not a dog problem. And that dog in a different setting or in a different home could have a full, happy life, and also encourage people to take the happy, healthy exercise of dog walking in a different context.
Paula.
Thank you, Convener. I agree with Steve's comments. I think it's something that, you know, in a different environment, a dog could easily thrive. But I think if this were a situation, then one thing that should sit alongside that move of the dog's home would be appropriate rehabilitation and training of that dog, which is not to say that it should live in a rural environment to allow it. But I think there should be an element of rehabilitation, so at least that the new owner can perhaps spot the signs of the dog being alerted to other animals. But I think to euthanize a dog on the basis of an incident, I think would be incredibly heavy-handed without perhaps going through a process first of all.
Okay, Stuart, I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Convener. I suspect the answer to this question has been developed through some of the previous answers, but specifically the powers to exclude defending owners from walking dogs on agricultural land. And I kind of wonder what your thoughts are, but in particular, how do people know what is agricultural land is one of the sort of questions I have in my mind in this context, in that, for example, our 3 acres of rough hill grazing are only occupied by animals a third of the year. So for 2/3 of the year, it just looks like an empty grass field. And indeed, only a few hundred metres away, we've got land which is a triple SI and not agricultural land. And again, it may not be obvious to the casual observer. So I just wonder how useful this power is thought to be by the panel. Are there circumstances where it can be helpful? Or where it might be challenging, although I may have attempted to answer that latter question myself.
I think you may have done, Stuart, but let's see if Bridget's got an answer for that. Bridget, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think you have answered it. I think it was perhaps even in the previous panel as well. I think the enforceability, I think, is probably one aspect, and certainly public understanding of what agricultural land is. And I think my previous point about land use in Scotland kind of fits with that as well. So yeah, tricky one for public to understand, but I'll let others chip in.
Okay, I'll probably go to Mike next, if I may, and ask you, Mike, if you've got any views on that.
Well, I mean, I think I will have to go back to a point Steve made earlier on. There are a lot of responsible farmers that put up signs saying livestock, but if you've walked past that sign for 8 months and there's no livestock, it kind of loses its impact. So signage was targeted that there is livestock present, and everybody's got to access somewhere. So if there was a reasonable place to put that sign, you could reasonably expect people to know, oh, there is livestock present.
Briefly, I could come to Steve, if you'd like to add something there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a key point, because if you look in the definitions of the 53 Act that this bill refers to, it refers to agricultural land as, amongst other things, being any land used for grazing. And certainly just thinking up in the Highlands and Islands here, we've got our North Ronaldsay sheep that graze on the beach. So basically that could be anywhere, because even in arable areas where you've got a crop rotation and some grazing, I just don't think that will be helpful. And agree with the other comments that it's far better for that to be targeted and help people do the right thing. Because what's going to happen if the dog isn't exercised properly? We're going to see other problems with that dog manifest itself. So that clause, I think, really should have some scrutiny and in my view, be removed.
Okay, I think we've probably got a flavour there. I'm going to come to the Deputy Convener now, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. And I want to explore this bit about definitions a bit more closely. And it's probably important to say that this proposed legislation is consolidation and updating of existing legislation, and it isn't new legislation. So there was nearly universal support among respondents to expand the definition of livestock, for example. We've talked about that, and the types of land. But there is confusion about some of the definitions. So, for example, if I could quote, Convener, the Law Society of Scotland raised that there is no definition for field. Surprised at that. And note that in terms of definitions, they note that under section 1, bracket 2, bracket C of the 1953 Act, the offence refers to worrying livestock as meaning being at large, that is to say, not on a lead or otherwise under close control in a field or enclosure in which there are sheep. We wonder if it would be better to define what a field is as common grazing, but that common grazing has another meaning, as I take it, under crofting legislation. So, however, may be a significant area which may or may not be enclosed. And the Scottish Outdoor Access Code refers to being under close control. So would this be better than reference to a lead? And it's obvious that the code should be consistent with the legislation for purposes of clarity and transparency. So I suppose my question is to the panellists, what are your views on the extension of the definitions in the 1953 Act? And are there areas where you feel this should be clarified?
And I guess if all the panel were in the room, they'd all look away in the first instance so that somebody else could answer the first question. You don't have the ability to do that. So as it's to start off with, access and outdoor access, Bridget, you're in the firing line for that.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah, in terms of the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, so I'll just go back to basics briefly. Under the Land Reform Scotland Act, there's a right to responsible access to most land in Scotland. The Act explicitly refers to anybody that's taking a dog which is not under control falls out with access rights. So that's very, very clear. If your dog's not under control, access rights don't apply. The Scottish Outdoor Access Code then gives further advice and guidance on what responsible control would be. And in terms of dogs, it's a little bit complicated, but to try and simplify it, if there is a field with young animals in it, lambs, calves, foals, you do not take your dog into that field at that time, and that's responsible behaviour. If there's a field with animals, not young, you can take your dog into that field, but it must be on a lead or under close control. And to clarify, under close control, we generally refer to that as being close at heel. It's a little bit easier for the public to understand. The dog is at your heel. And that is why we've got this kind of split between when your dog's on a lead and when your dog can be off a lead, but under close control. When you get to the wider countryside, then your dog's under close control and you stay away from animals if you can. So hopefully that clarifies it in the context of the Scottish Outdoor Access Code and land reform.
Okay, Steve, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, thank you. As people have brought forward, this is a nightmare. And the key thing for me is that the impact on the farmer or the suffering on the animal doesn't matter whether it was in an enclosed field or whether it was in byland or whether it was common grazings. So I would really encourage the panel to look at deed rather than location, because it's a nightmare. And if we just come back to the bill itself, just saying that, dogs shouldn't attack or worry livestock anywhere. And I think that's far greater focus, because we know situations, we've got cattle in Pollock Park. The Kennel Club has its own 7,500 acres of land where we've got Galloway cattle and sheep. Are you saying that in a big area like that, just because there's one or two might be sheep miles and miles away, you wouldn't know that the onus should be on the owner, to informed by good information, to just not allow their dog to attack or worry livestock, and by introducing definitions of where it is, apart from the case where livestock are strayed into somebody's garden, which is already dealt with in the legislation. To be honest, getting tied up in sort of land is difficult for the reasons that the various bodies have said, that actually it's just not acceptable for dogs to injure or attack livestock anywhere. And this is, to me, a bit of a side issue that we should be careful not to fall into a trap with.
Okay, Paula, would you like to come in on that?
Thank you, convener. I have no comments on that. It's not my area of expertise, and I agree with Kirstine's comments.
Okay, and in fairness, as I've given everyone a chance, Steve, do you want to say anything? Not Steve, Mike, sorry. Do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, my only comment on that would be the term close control. Your idea of close control of your dog and my idea would be totally different. If it's on a lead, it's under control.
Okay. Right. I think many owners may feel they've got their dog under control without necessarily a lead. Sorry. Maureen, is there stuff that you would like?
That's fine. I think we've got our work cut out in this bit.
Thank you. I think there are some questions from Christine Graham.
Yeah, I was listening very carefully to what Bridget Jones was saying about the access code. Could you just clarify for me, currently, is the access code sufficient if this bill were to become law to put into the access code information that still allow people access, but subject to, making sure that animal didn't worry sheep or other livestock? Is it sufficient, or does it need changed?
Bridget, that's definitely you.
Yeah, I think it's sufficient.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the code's very clear. The Land Reform Act's very clear. And I think the important bit will be, as I think somebody alluded to earlier on, is that if this legislation goes through, that we have public awareness raising campaign and we get the messages out nice and clear for the public to understand.
Christine.
Yeah, that brings me neatly to my supplementary as the member who brought forward the Control of Dogs Scotland Act, that at that time there was no duty on the Scottish Government to publicise members' bills. That may be changing, but do you take the view that I take, that if this were to proceed, there's no point in it proceeding unless the public were aware of the legislation, and indeed tying it up with the access code, because a member doesn't have the money to publicise their bill, but the government has, and to me, all legislation is equal. So I'd like their comments on publicity And not just a one-hit publicity when the bill, if it is such, becomes law, but continuing public awareness.
Okay, Bridget, I think that's back to you as well.
Yes, I mean, we generally, there is a rolling programme of education and awareness that goes on, and it just fluctuates each year depending on what the sort of priority topics are. So particularly seasonal stuff like round about lambing time and so on, which I've mentioned before. But yeah, I mean, in short, the answer is yes. You know, we're fully aware that there are various issues that come along with access to the outdoors and dog walking. And you know, in recent research, you're not that far shy of 50% of people that take access into the outdoors to enjoy the countryside for health and well-being benefits being accompanied by a dog. It's a primary motivator for getting people outdoors. So we want to make sure that they're out there and enjoying themselves responsibly, and in working in conjunction with the National Access Forum, with Spark, with the land management NGOs and the recreational NGOs to ensure we get a good joined up campaign out there, ensuring that the public know what they are allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, and how to behave responsibly. And if this legislation goes through and there's increases in fines and so on, then that's a message that we can incorporate in there if it's appropriate to the audience that we're targeting.
Christine, do you want to come back on that, or?
I just want, because it's an opportunity for these witnesses to put at the door of the Scottish Government a continuing duty to publicise, if this goes through, a members' bill, which hasn't been happening to date. So that I would like, a little push for that, because I know it didn't happen to mine, hasn't happened to other members' bills. And I think if we could have that, as they do their own legislation, then, this makes work worthwhile for members with their bills.
Okay, so definitely go to you, Mike. In fact, I'll go to each of the panel members before I come to the member who's raising this bill. So, Mike, do you have comments on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Christine Graham said. I mean, if you take Christine's bill to control the dogs, there are millions of people in Scotland, or hundreds of thousands, that don't even know it exists. Local authorities are not enforcing it right. People have to be made aware. And as we said at the very beginning, this kind of legislation has got to be accompanied by a public campaign. And it's not just a one advert in a paper on the 1st of April or something. It's got to be continual.
Thank you. Steve, followed by Paula.
Yeah, thank you. No, I absolutely agree. I mean, there's no point in legislation if people don't know about it. But I would come to the point that already in the 2003 Act that underpins the Access Code, there it talks about access rights not applying if your dog isn't kept under proper control. And that's something which is very context specific, and that's really, really clear. I don't think anybody would argue that a dog, worrying or attacking livestock is under proper control. I mean, it is a key thing for us because at the end of the day, deficiencies here are also an animal welfare issue for the dog often, not just for the livestock. And certainly, I know all the people at SNH, Nature Scot now work really hard, but we know historically there was a series of sharing good practice events which helped land managers, other access managers on all sorts of things, but we did a number of events on dogs there. And we are very mindful that it seems that the resources aren't there at the moment, and yet a fundamental part of the Access Code is responsibilities on the part of people taking access, land managers and the statutory agencies. And it would seem unfair on both dog owners and land managers if there isn't that part played to educate, because as we said at the start, this is an unintentional crime. How do you deal with something unintentional? It's making sure people are better informed. So it's a brilliant question.
Okay, and Paula.
I totally agree with the previous comments. This is something that, should this bill go forward, you then have something that has significant sanctions and penalties for the owner of the dog. And I think that in itself could start to be the beginnings of a preventive tool, that if folks realise that they are not just going to get away scot-free or with in effect, metaphorically, a slap on the wrist, that in itself could be very, very powerful. So absolutely, we need to be able to highlight and promote that this legislation is there and that it can and will be used.
Thank you. Christine, does that answer your...
That's absolutely fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask Emma Harper, who's Bill it is to ask if she has any questions. Emma, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Yes, thank you, conveners. Just to pick up on what Paula was just saying, that the purpose of updating 67-year-old legislation was to convey the importance of this offence. And I just want to remind everybody, it's not new legislation, it's updating old legislation. But just to ask maybe if we need to focus on, in the actual bill, issues of compensation law, which already exists. So rather than create a whole new set of compensation language, should this bill refer people to other existing law? But also, I'm interested in if the panels think that the number of incidents recorded will actually go up because farmers will then, they'll now have confidence that this bill has a bit more gravitas, so that when they do report offences, that something will actually be done now.
Okay, and I'll give every panel member a chance to answer those questions. And I'm going to start with Mike. So Mike, if you'd like to kick off, then I'll go to Steve, followed by Paula, followed by Bridget.
Yeah, I agree with what Emma's saying there. I do reckon if this legislation comes in, more farmers will be encouraged to report it, thinking that it is worthwhile doing and to try and solve the problem. When it comes to compensation, I can only really speak about the Animal Health and Welfare Act 2006. There is measures there for us to be compensated for our costs. But unless it's willingly given, we've got to take civil action against that to recover the costs. And that, again, can take months to get through court, can be very costly, and then you find out that the person's not got any money to actually pay it in the first place.
Okay. Steve, would you like to come on that now?
Yeah, certainly. Whilst provisions are there, I think in essence, well, absolutely in essence, the compensation isn't working. And I'm mindful, just as an NFUS member as well as my other role, of a report here where a farm in at Kirk Newton, the loss was £20,000. The adjacent farm where it came from, not Walker's, but it was an adjacent holding. The owner of the dogs got a £400 fine and no compensation was awarded. And then NFUS had been asking Procurator Fistel and the Scottish Crown Office to increase things. So it is there in theory, but it isn't happening. And so, you know, the opportunity to deal with that, I think, should be taken if we can. But equally, again, I would still be coming back to prevention, but it's absolutely right that people should be properly compensated for what happens. But there's certainly concerns there.
Thank you. Paula.
Thank you. In terms of reporting, as I mentioned earlier on, I think the important thing is that we need a good baseline. So suggestion would be that we actually start looking at that immediately in terms of making sure that we've got good, robust reporting and recording mechanisms at the police level, so that we're getting consistent recording. I think it's also really important that we actually actively encourage farmers to report now, rather than waiting until the bill potentially goes through, because then that gives us a baseline, so then we know how effective it's being in terms of as things move forward. In terms of compensation, I think it's something that, you know, if there is already legislation written there, then it does make sense to refer to that. But again, going back to a previous comment, I do think it would be sensible to actually deal with compensation at the time that the case goes through to court, so it's dealt with in the one sitting rather than later on, because then the court has the benefit of hearing, for example, the extent of the loss, and including the level of suffering that's been undertaken or encountered by the sheep or whichever livestock it is, so that you get a full picture of the actual impact of that that particular incident.
Thank you. And Bridget, do you want to come back on?
Just briefly, I'm just echoing what Paula's point about the quality of information that we get with any reporting of incidents, because that will help target any kind of campaign and awareness raising activity that we do. If we've got a better idea of what's happening, where, in what kind of circumstances, that will make that job a bit easier.
Thank you. Emma, does that answer your questions?
Yes, thanks, convener. I've found this very, very helpful. It's weird being on this side as a proposer of a bill, but I want to thank the members and the witnesses for their input today. It's been very, very helpful.
Thank you, Emma, for that. Just before we close on that, I mean, one of the questions that sprung to my mind is people have said about signage. And it's the whole issue of what is appropriate signage. For example, if you go onto the hills of Scotland, you may see no sheep for miles. You may suddenly come across sheep round a knoll that you didn't know exists. And it's not appropriate to have signage. Do we not think that we shouldn't have to rely, farmers shouldn't have to rely on signage? They should rely on people knowing what is appropriate to do with their dog. And I'm just going to ask each panel member to come back to me on that. Mike, do you want to start off with that?
Yes, convener, I agree with what you're saying. They shouldn't have to rely on signage, but it's just an extra safeguard for the individual farmer that if he has moved livestock in an area, if there is a suitable access point, you can warn people. That would be an added benefit. But you're quite right. The law stands. The dogs should be under control.
Okay. Steve.
Thank you, convener. I mean, you're absolutely right. There's an issue of context here between a 3 or 4 acre field on the edge of Livingston compared to a big open grazing in the Highlands. I think a good example for me is that when you're driving a car, you have the responsibility to adjust your speed and how you drive accordingly, whatever. But we still put up signs when there's bends or a ford or something coming up to give you that little bit of information to make a more informed decision. And I think that's the point with signage, that if it's everywhere, then it loses value anyway. But certainly if there's been incidents that have happened, again, unintentionally, then that's somewhere to keep it clear. Or if somebody's on an open grazing, to make the point at the point of entry that you may not see a sheep here now, but actually there are sheep are grazed here at present. So keep a lookout or whatever it is.
Paula, followed by Bridget.
Thank you, convener. I think with signage, again, what's very clear is that there is no one magic wand that is going to solve this issue, and therefore I think signage is just one of those tools in the box that we can utilise. I think it's been previously mentioned, using signage at the appropriate time of year, so it's not something that we become conditioned to, particularly if you're walking the same route, so you know specifically when animals are there. It's just an extra warning for individuals. So no, it's not a panacea, but I think they, in the right context, they can be useful.
And finally, Bridget, signs in the countryside.
Yeah, I think really just to follow on that, they're one of the tools in the box. I think if used well, they can be quite effective, particularly in situations where there's maybe a change in circumstances, so that the lambs are in that field, sign up and relevant. Don't leave it up all year. People will just ignore it. But yeah, using a kind of a communications plan type approach, there's all sorts of different ways of getting messages across. Obviously, there's digital platforms available, social media options are there, but don't forget the traditional talking to people, face-to-face stuff. That little article in your local newsletter, or a visit up to the community council just to spread the word about maybe some issues that are happening in the area. All good ways of getting messages across, but combined approach is the trick.
Okay, thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of our questions this morning. So I'd like to thank the panel members for the time that they've given. It's been extremely helpful. And if I could ask the committee members to stay seated, because we just have an opportunity to review the evidence we've heard this morning. So I suspend the formal part of the meeting. I end the formal part of the meeting.